Hello, welcome back to another Doctor Who Big Finish audio drama review. Today we'll be taking a look at the second to last episode of the Doctor Who Big Finish main range of 2018, which is of course another 7th Doctor story, being The Muse of Fire, as written by Paul Mars. Now this episode does of course feature the 7th Doctor, Ace and Hex, along the return of the Big Finish mental time-travelling auntie that is of course Iris Wildthyme, as played by Katie Manning, along with her rather unusual psychic Panda, who is in fact called Panda. So this release is in fact one of which that I was incredibly excited to listen to. If you in fact watched my previous review from the Big Finish main range, you'll of course know that I haven't experienced anything from the Iris Wildthyme series before, therefore this review is very much a first encounter for me, so that is always interesting when that happens on this channel, because it is essentially a Big Finish classic and my first ever experience of that. Of course, due to it being at the very end of 2018, this release isn't in fact alone as a part of the Big Finish main range. We do also have a 6th Doctor story to end out this year, which is of course called The Hunting Ground, and it is a 6th Doctor only story. There's no companion in that episode, and I will in fact be reviewing that soon to end out this year with the Doctor Who Big Finish reviews. I can't believe we are at the end already. Honestly, 2018 has gone incredibly quick, but also on a positive note, we've in fact reviewed lots of very high quality Big Finish audio dramas. So first off, and as always, in the description below I will leave the link to go and buy this release from the Big Finish website. It is currently out now, as this is a standard single CD release. Of course it is at the physical retail price of $14.99, and the download version is $12.99, and I do believe that it will be available to purchase from other retailers that aren't Big Finish at the end of January in 2019, but up until that point it is of course a Big Finish exclusive. If you are in fact interested by what I say throughout this review, you can also check out all the story details on the Big Finish website along with the casting information, and you can also listen to the trailer for this release as well. And also get a little bit of a closer look at the actual cover art for this story, which I must say is in fact a rather interesting cover that has been actually inspired by the rather intriguing different pieces of art that are around at the time of 1920s France, including the likes of Picasso and that rather unusual style. So it is certainly a Big Finish cover like no other. That kind of rhymed. That was kind of cool. So taking a look at some of the production details on the Big Finish website now, as I was saying earlier, this episode is in fact written by Paul Margs. He has written a few Big Finish audio dramas in the past, including Jago and Lightfoot, I do believe. This episode is in fact directed by Jamie Anderson, the producer is Nicholas Briggs, the script editor is Alan Barnes, and as per usual the executive producers are Jason Haig Ellery and Nicholas Briggs. Moving on to the actual casting for this story, Sylvester McCoy does of course play the 7th Doctor. And once again, much like in the previous audio drama reviews that I've done so far this year for the 7th Doctor, we once again encounter a much different style of 7th Doctor throughout this episode. I did in fact find him incredibly enjoyable. I feel like I'm almost drained for 7th Doctor adventures at the minute, because we've essentially had a review that has gone out, I do believe, every single month relating to the 7th Doctor since September, I think it's been. So yeah, we've had a lot of 7th Doctor this year, which I suppose is a good thing for the people that are 7th Doctor fans. And I must say, over that period of time, I have got to like the 7th Doctor more. We do see a much more fun side of the 7th Doctor throughout this episode that is very interested in actually meeting these historical figures, which is really nice. It's nice to see the fan side of the Doctor coming out in this episode, and we do also have his interactions with Iris Wildthyme in there as well. Sophie Aldred, who plays Ace. Once again, similar compliments I have normally for Ace and Sophie Aldred. Generally, she slips back into the role absolutely effortlessly. She's a great companion. It's great to see her relationship with the Doctor in another adventure. I don't particularly have much to say about her in this episode. However, once again, it was nice to see her reactions with Iris Wildthyme, considering that she's heard about her from previous adventures. I have the other companion throughout this episode, who is played by Philip Oliver, who is of course Hex. Now currently at the time of filming, I've not really experienced too many of Hex's adventures. Of course I have previously reviewed, I believe, the A.K. Benedict story, Worlds Apart. I can't remember what the other episode in that sort of two-part story was called. Also, more recently this year, I have reviewed the excellent 51 to 100 story, Live 34. The episode stood out to me because it is incredibly unique, and Hex was in that story as well, so it's nice to have a bit more expansion for his character. For those of you that actually like Hex as a person, I think that he really nicely contrasts with Ace. I think their relationship is rather unusual because course some episodes they are almost in a relationship. Then other episodes they are more like friends that just have a lot of banter, or even a brother and sister almost relationship, which is a little bit odd considering you are going from almost relationships to a brother and sister relationship. It's just a rather unusual character, and I think that Hex kind of takes a little bit of a back seat throughout this story. I was expecting a little bit more from him, however the scenes that we did get were really enjoyable and fun, and wanted to see him interact with Iris considering he doesn't really know who she is as a person. And speaking of the mental auntie, we do of course have Iris Wildthyme as played by Katie Manning, who does of course play Jo Grant from the Third Doctor era, and Katie Manning is just such a delight. Honestly, I speak personally from actually meeting her in real life. She's one of the warmest, kindest people that I've ever had the pleasure of meeting when it comes to Doctor Who cast members, and that is very much reflected in Iris Wildthyme. I didn't quite know what to expect from her. All I really knew was an elderly auntie figure that is a little bit mad, possibly losing it, and she has a time-travelling double-decker bus, I do believe on the number 22 route, which I think, why not? You know, she is a cool, wacky character, and what I like for this story is it does essentially introduce her again. The fact that I don't have any prior knowledge really to Iris Wildthyme, the fact that I haven't listened to any of her adventures in the past, I didn't really feel that that hindered this story. If anything, it was a jumping on point, which is great for new listeners, but also at the same time it is a great release for those who are fans of Iris Wildthyme as well, because you get more adventures with her, which I guess what is not to like about that. And of course we're actually meeting another Doctor as well, being the 7th Doctor, who I do believe has a slightly different relationship with Iris compared to the other Doctors, such as this elderly northern auntie-grandma kind of figure, and you think that she's the antagonist, you think that she is a time traveller where she doesn't really know what she's doing. However, you kind of see at the end of the episode that maybe she doesn't necessarily have too bad motives after all. Then of course we have David Benson as Panda, who I literally didn't know existed up until the actually listening of this episode, and I was really invested in his character. Of course I am a massive fan of Frobisher from the 6th Doctor episode The Holy Terror. He is a shapeshifter that takes the form of a penguin. He is a Whiffadil, and in this episode we have a panda with a gun who is this mad art critic kind of character, and he is so bizarre yet funny at the same time, and he has a really strong bond with Iris Wildthyme. And yeah, I love Panda. I love him within one story. I don't know any of his history really, which again, what is not to like about that? It is quirky, it is different, and it's something that Big Finish honestly do best, and I just want to see Panda and Frobisher meet at some point in a 6th Doctor story, because that will probably be one of the best moments in Doctor Who history. Also mentioning the other cast members as well, which I will of course encounter throughout talking about the narrative later on in the review. We have Gethin Anthony, who plays Kevin Archer slash Darley, the famous artist. Then we have Rebecca LaChance, who plays Isabel Archer. We have Christine Cavalga, I do believe you pronounce her name as Dora Muse, who once again, she was intriguing. She was almost the other villain for this story, and she was an interesting concept. And finally, not necessarily for the cast, but I'd just like to give some other technical details, sort of shouts out for this review. We do also have the sound design by Daniel Burnett, who does a very good job, very atmospheric, and you actually believe that you are in 1920s France throughout this story, and that is really nicely aided as well by Benji Clifford's music design. It is really lovely, really fits the theme and the location and the time setting of this story, and it's nice to have an episode in France, historical France. Now moving on to the story and narrative for this episode, and what I really like about it is Paul Mars has basically created a 2-hour Doctor Who story that is a really fun drama, but also a good romp at the same time. It's something of which that once again I recommend to a Big Finish new listener, because this is one of those stories that I could simply click play on and listen to throughout until the very end, through the full 2 hours, and just really enjoy it. It was a nice evening listen that you can just relax to, get introduced to all of the different characters on the way, and because of the very small cast list, it is in fact an episode that you can slip into very easily. Within the first episode, you know who all of the characters are, you know their different plots and their set different aims. Trimming down the story into almost its bare different components, Iris basically creates a salon, which is where people who have creative talents can in fact go to display their talents, and that is something that is very fitting to the area of 1920s Paris, because you have many different talents congregating on Paris in this time period. You have poets, writers, artists, people who are actors and actresses all coming together to display the talents that they have. However, the alien of this story, it turns out, has a slightly different motive, and Iris kind of wants to create new talents that we are not aware of as listeners. So this story very much has reference to people such as, say, Picasso, as well as Dali as well. However, they don't really have too much of a prominence throughout this episode, and you in fact see in the early act, when the companions actually interact with these famous figures, they're almost at the end of their journey when it comes to this actual episode, and you see them exit and you don't really see them come back until the very end. So I think it may have been nice just to give a bit more context into those historical figures, because as you all know, I love historical episodes of Doctor Who, and when you bring in historical figures, regardless of what background that they have came from, the sheer fact that they are a famous historical figure, I think that Doctor Who should use that to its benefit, and if you have the opportunity to bring in a historical figure, you should certainly utilise that. And I do think that although this story is interesting and a nice drama, it still would have been nice to maybe have a few more components in there that relate to the actual historical figures, such as Picasso, such as Dali, having a little bit of a Doctor Who twist on the way that they deliver their own art pieces. Of course, there is a brilliant Picasso painting that is very well known. It is the Melting Clocks. That whole idea of almost time distortions, and is time really sort of a thing? Is it reality, or is it just something that our minds have recreated? Perhaps we could have another episode in the future dedicated completely to Picasso and maybe experiences around that, maybe a follow-up episode. It was nice in the way that Paul Marks made this episode not exactly predictable. It did something different. It introduced Iris's character, and even though I've not seen the previous adventures that she is in, I still kind of get a grasp on who she is as a person and what she is doing and why she's doing it. And this whole idea of creating historical figures, not because she wants to do bad or disrupt history and the timelines, but in fact because she has a different motive behind it that the Doctor might actually be in favour with. Which is certainly a concept in this episode that I didn't see coming, which makes for a really interesting twist in the final act in episode 4 of this story. I'm moving back onto Panda because I absolutely love the character, to be honest. Discussing what he actually has in this story and his contribution, basically becomes a sad art critic that you can kind of imagine is an older male figure that is always sat at his desk sort of with a cigar or pipe, just writing things down on his typewriter, his own opinions, and making them heard in kind of a French publication. And you see the controversy behind him posting his reviews essentially and his opinions about these iconic famous artists and creators, and basically making these iconic people actually give up what they are doing, including Picasso and Dali, and then eventually making them move away from Paris and then changing in effect the course of history. And yet it's really intriguing and different to kind of see Doctor Who take on almost ratings and critics and reviews, because that is very much a response that every single Doctor Who story has, and it's nice to see that incorporated into an actual episode. And all the way throughout the duration, I was looking forward to that one moment where Iris and the Doctor would actually meet, and I think that it's no spoiler to say that it is in fact rather late on within the actual story itself, and it would have been nice to maybe have a little bit more interaction with Iris, because I think that she's just a powerful Doctor Who figure. It's nice to see that she's a female as well, and she's different because she's more elderly. She's not a time lady like Romana or Leela that are kind of young and action-packed. She's just an old woman with a double-decker bus that doesn't particularly know what she's doing, or does she? So it's kind of a nice, interesting character that I would have maybe liked to see the 7th Doctor talk with a little bit more, and not leave it entirely to almost the final episode of this release. It also may have been nice to see a bit more from Hex. I kind of think that the time in the story where Hex was of course absent was maybe dedicated a little bit more to the Doctor and his almost fan and the sort of coming out of him and wanting to go and see these different famous figures. Also having a brief mention to the actual monster or villain for this story, I suppose. You have Dora Muse, and I'm not really going to mention much about her or her motives because I kind of feel like the majority of her character and what she has to actually contribute to this episode is best left until the actual listen itself. It's certainly something that is worth experiencing if you're intrigued already by what I have said. One thing that I am actually going to mention is I love the way that her monster, or the way that she almost looks, is in fact inspired by Picasso's paintings to some extent. It is almost like, what if this bizarre art is in fact a real life creature from another dimension or another world? Well, what if one dimension has in fact those people that have the screaming faces, like the Silence, for example. We've seen in Doctor Who before that the design of creatures has been very much affected by different arts that we've seen. I like the way that, as I say, she is relevant to the actual theme of the episode, but as it comes to an actual villain, I don't think she has the presence of what a villain should have when it comes to a Doctor Who story. But I guess that's not necessarily the point for this episode. I think that the limelight is certainly belonging to Iris, and sort of the revelation that you have at the end of the story kind of makes that issue almost make sense. So overall, for the Doctor Who Big Finish 7th Doctor main range story, Muse of Fire, I think that this is a really entertaining listen, and something of which that I do recommend to all different parts of the Big Finish fandom. I think that if you are an experienced listener or a fan of Iris Wildtime, no doubt you will have already listened to this release already and already purchased it, simply because I think that the niches within Big Finish certainly have a very dedicated and passionate fandom behind them, such as, say, Jago and Lightfoot. I will naturally pre-order any release that comes out from Jago and Lightfoot before they're even released. I imagine that it is a similar situation for Iris as well. It is also a brilliant opportunity to almost get a taste of who Iris is as a person, and I think that considering from the perspective of me, who hasn't really actually listened to Iris in the past, I am certainly intrigued by her and may go on to in fact experience a few of her other releases in the future, maybe even her own spin-off, and see what she does when the Doctor isn't around and she has Panda alongside her. But I do think that it is fun, it's a great story and a great romp, and a nice one to end off these 7th Doctor adventures for this year as well. I'm almost a little bit 7th Doctor exhausted by this point, so I am pleasantly happy to report that, of course, the next Big Finish main range review on this channel, last of 2018 for this year, is in fact the Big Finish main range 6th Doctor story, The Hunting Ground, as written by A.K. Benedict. What a lovely way to end off this year of Big Finish reviews with a 6th Doctor story just by himself, so I can't wait to see the 6th Doctor basically owning the stage and being as wonderful and fabulous as he always is, because it's the 6th Doctor, and do you ever expect anything less from him? So thank you very much for watching this review. I hope you have enjoyed it. If you have any questions about this release, then please do leave them in the description below, and I will reply to them at some point in the near future. And also stay tuned for plenty more Doctor Who Big Finish audio drama reviews in the future, along with lots more content as well. So yeah, thank you all for watching, stay safe, have a nice day, I shall see you all next time. Bye for now.